I'm going to ask you to turn your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, the 18th chapter, Proverbs chapter 18, and I'll read verse 22. Proverbs 18, verse 22. Whoso finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains the favor of the Lord. I want you to think a moment about that statement, obtains the favor of the Lord. That word favor means the approval, the endorsement, the commendation of God. It's almost like a man who finds a wife is complimented for doing so by God himself. Solomon had many other positive things to say about the institution of marriage. In Proverbs, the 19th chapter and the 14th verse, he wrote, "Houses and riches are the inheritance of fathers, but an understanding wife is from the Lord." Such a wife is a blessing from God. In Proverbs, back in the 12th chapter, in the 4th verse, he said, "An excellent wife is the crown of her husband." I guess we would say it's like icing on the cake of marriage. And most of you are very familiar with Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs 31 verse 10, "Who can find a virtuous wife, for her worth is far above rubies?" Well, Solomon was not the only one who had some positive things to say about marriage. Even Jesus clearly approved of marriage. You may remember that he performed his very first miracle at a wedding celebration in Cana of Galilee, as recorded in John the 2nd chapter, where he turned a huge amount of water into wine. But let me also read from Mark the 10th chapter, verses 6 through 9, where he repeats some of what is written in the book of Genesis chapter 2. "And Jesus said, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. What, therefore, God has joined together, let not man separate." Last Sunday, in honor of Chase and Taylor's recent wedding, I began sharing some marital guidance from the Bible. And I'm going to conclude that with one scripture we'll look at today that provides invaluable guidance for any marriage. Just 19 words that'll make a tremendous difference in any marriage. Would you turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 3. The verse begins with the word let. That means this is something like a command. You must comply. It's not an option. It's not a suggestion. It's not advice, in other words. Let the husband render, which means to give, to grant to his wife, the affection due her. By affection here, the Greek word can refer to physical affection, such as touching, embracing, or even the sexual relationship. It can also refer to the emotional needs. When it talks about the affection, to fulfill the emotional needs or desires of the wife. So let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. Due her means she is deserving of it. And that's why this is written in the imperative. This is not an option, husbands. This is something you must do, but it's not just written for husbands. It continues, and likewise also the wife to her husband. She should do the same. To put it another way, the husband must give his wife all she needs physically and emotionally. And the wife must give her husband all he needs physically and emotionally. Let me ask you a question. Do you know, you who are married, exactly what your spouse needs physically and emotionally. And I'm not referring to the material needs of food, clothing, shelter, or in Brenda's case, coffee. I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about what they need from you physically and emotionally. Do you know? Well, let me ask you another question. When was the last time you asked them what they need from you? And folks, if you don't ask, how do you know? Some people say, well, I've been living with them long enough, I know. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe not. I can say this, if you do not provide for them what they need from you physically, emotionally, then you're in violation of 1 Corinthians 7, verse 3, simple as that. And speaking of which, every single one of us has different needs physically and emotionally. And folks, hear me, the only way you can know for certain what the physical and emotional needs of your spouse is to ask them. This is not a guessing game. And keep asking. Now that said, most spouses have 3 needs. There may be some who don't, but the vast majority do, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. The needs, physical, emotional needs of virtually every spouse. Number 1, every spouse needs to know that they are loved. The mistake so many spouses make that eventually leads to divorce court is we assume we know what they need. You've undoubtedly heard the story about a woman married many years, asked her husband one day, "Do you still love me?" And he said, "I told you I love you the day we got married. And if I ever change my mind, you'll be the first to know." Well, that's not a very good way of doing it. Listen to me. Surveys indicate that 60% of couples married in excess of 5 years feel unloved a good part of the time. Maybe not all the time. Should your spouse ever feel unloved? Biblically speaking, you know the answer to that. No. So why is it that many couples, or at least one spouse or the other, in a marriage of 5 years or more, feels at times unloved? Well, there are only 2 reasons. Number 1, because they are unloved. Now, that's the vast minority. The isolated case, where they're just not loved. They're just not loved. It's amazing how many people just stay together for the sake of children or family pressures or other issues, which is sad, tragic. But the biggest reason so many feel unloved at times is because they're not consistently shown that they're loved. And I mean shown. In 1 John 3:18, John says, "My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue." It's easy to say, "I love you," and yes, you may mean it, but he goes on to say, "but in deed and in truth." Love has to be demonstrated. Read the book of James, you'll find that out very, very quickly. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, Peter says, "Husbands, likewise, dwell with them, your wife, according to understanding." With understanding. Understanding what? What makes them know that they're loved. Now, you husbands may already be doing that, and if you are, good for you. Keep it up. But not all husbands even know, really, for sure, what makes their wives feel loved. And Titus chapter 2, verse 4, talking to the older women of the church, it says they're to admonish the young women to love their husbands. How? To demonstrate that love, to find out what makes the husband feel loved and to do it. So again, I ask, what makes your spouse feel loved? It's surprising the number of men who don't have a clue. Oh, I'm sorry. They think they have a clue, and they're guessing, but they don't have it right. Or else, if they know what makes their spouse feel loved, they don't show it. Not nearly enough. It's been estimated that is the case for about 70% of men who've been married very long, and women, only a little better, about 50% of women. And again, I ask, how can you know for certain what makes them feel loved unless you ask them? Speaking of which, never, ever make this mistake. Assume that what makes you feel loved makes your spouse feel loved. Some years ago, a wealthy couple that were on the verge of divorce went to see a marital counselor. The counselor said, "What's the problem?" The wife says, "He doesn't love me anymore." He said, "What? What? I buy you everything you can want. I mean, I get you jewelry. I get you furs. I just bought you a new car. And you say I don't love you." And here's what she said. She said, "Oh, I'm grateful for the gifts. But what I want from you is to take some time with me and just sit and talk with me and just hold me. And you haven't given me that in years." I got to reveal a secret about Chase and Taylor. I think they'll forgive me. Something that makes Taylor feel loved is when Chase just reaches out and grabs her hand, holds her hand, just to do it. Something that makes Chase feel loved when Taylor just comes up for no reason and gives him a big hug and looks in his eyes and say, "I love you so much." We talked about that recently, and that's something they need to continue to do. And one other thing about making sure your spouse knows that they're loved is, folks, what makes them feel loved may change in time. It may be the same for years. It may change in 2 months. So you have to ask them, what can I do to make you feel loved? And I'm serious about that. One case, many years ago, I'd been counseling with a couple about doing some of these very things. And one of them was asking. So several months after this, and I'm thinking it was at least 5 or 6 months, I asked the wife, I asked the husband. They weren't together. We were in the church building. She was over here, and I just walked up to him at first. Then I got to her. So I walked up to him. His name was Jerry, and I said, "Jerry, how's it going with some of the things we talked about?" He said, "Oh, it's going great." So you're asking her what she needs from you to feel loved. "Oh, yeah, I've asked her." He said, "I forget the number of times I asked." I'm glad I didn't just believe all that. No, I wanted to, and I intended to. But I walked up to her and I said, "Hey, I hear things are going really well in your marriage." And she said, "Well, I wouldn't say really well, but pretty well." I said, "Okay, well, at least your husband's asking you. Jerry's asking you." She looked at me and she said, "You know, since that time you told us to do that back months ago, he's never asked once." Seriously. I don't know if he just thought he was asking or what. Folks, you got to ask. I'm just telling you. All right, quickly. Number 2, whatever your spouse needs, they need to feel that they're loved, and they need to know that they're loved unconditionally. I can't tell you how important that is. You see, it's so easy to love your spouse, or anybody for that matter, but especially your spouse, if they look and act just right, if she cooks your favorite meal, if you take her out or buy her flowers or candy, whatever it is that she would like from you, even doing the dishes, or if she mows the lawn, which my wife does. But how much do you love your spouse when they've been lazy for a week? Or as one person put it, useless for a month? Or especially grouchy? Or they forget your birthday or your anniversary? Or as one wife told me, he's been acting like an idiot. or spending too much money, how do you feel about them? How do you treat them then? This is important. According to the Apostle Paul, here's what you do if your spouse has been guilty of any of that. You bear all things, believe all things, hope all things. You endure. Your love endures it all. That doesn't mean you may be happy with what you're doing, and you may need to talk to him about it, but as far as how you feel and how you act, that doesn't change. If that changes, there's a problem. The Apostle Peter said in 1 Peter 4, verse 8, and above all things have fervent love. Now that is agape. That's unconditional love that never stops. Never draws a line, says, you cross this line, I don't love you anymore. Agape love, as I preached many months, never draws lines, no matter what you do. Have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Love treats a person with love. Treats a person with love even when they make a lot of mistakes. Now, let me just emphasize how important it is that you make sure your spouse knows they are loved no matter what. One of my biggest issues in life, I rarely feel unconditional love from others to me. I rarely feel it. Brenda does a very good job trying to show me. But it's hard. Now, it's not that people don't love me unconditionally. Many people do. It's just hard for me to believe that they do. Because as I was growing up, unconditional love was not present in my home. It wasn't there. And I'm not trying to put down my parents. They had their own issues, and they had a lot of issues as a couple. I'll tell you something. When my mom made a mistake, my dad, and I'm not talking about burning down the house. When she made a mistake, my dad might not talk to her for weeks. Now, my mom didn't always respond in kind, but there were many days that went by she would not have a word to say to him because of a mistake or something he did that she did not approve of. And folks, when we as children did something wrong, especially something really wrong, we were ignored. And I'm not talking about for hours. I'm talking about for a week, sometimes more. My sister picked up on that so well that on one occasion, she just turned 16. My mother, if I recall, spanked her severely for something. My sister decided she would not talk to my mother anymore. Not say a word. I mean, not a word. Not yes, no, not even mm-hmm or mm-mm. How long? A week? No. 2? No. 3? No. 4? No. 5? No. 10? No. 20? No. 26 weeks. My sister would not say a word to my mother. That may have gone on a year or more, except my father literally bribed her by buying her a horse to get her just to say yes or no to my mother. My sister picked up on what was happening between my parents and ran with it. And that's why sometimes I have trouble feeling others love me unconditionally, even when they do. Do you see this? Some of you remember this. This is purchased by some of you, and little notes written to me about appreciation, love. Thank you for being our minister. There were more. Those that are in here, I've never looked at one of these. Now, I read about 35 others. When you didn't understand unconditional love growing up, it's really hard. I'm praying one day I'll read all the rest of those. One of the greatest gifts you'll give your spouse, no matter what they do, you love them and show them. Whether they have an off day, off week, off month, no matter how frustrated you feel, and you have a right to, don't ever let them doubt that you love them And that will never change. And lastly, the third thing every spouse needs is praise. Praise. I don't know for sure. I do not think I have ever heard a husband or wife say, they praise me too much. I don't think I've heard that. Some people say, well, if you praise your spouse too much, it'll go to their head. Maybe that happens. I've never seen it. I've never seen someone become egotistical as a result of honest praise and recognition. But I know people who are starving emotionally because they get so little, if any, praise at all. And that's tragic because that includes many spouses. Now, one statistic, surveys of couples in the United States filing for divorce indicate that the one constant, the one thing all those couples, thousands, had in common was a lack of praise. Lack of praise. And the cure is easy. In Proverbs 15, verse 4, Solomon had a lot to say about this. He said, a wholesome tongue is a tongue that builds up, encourages, is a tree of life. It gives life. It gives people a reason to go on living. Proverbs 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue. You can destroy and kill with the tongue, but you can bring back to life. You can heal, you can help, and you can encourage. Proverbs 15:23, a word spoken in due season. How good. That Hebrew word means how beneficial it is. Words fitly spoken, Proverbs 25:11, is like apples of gold in frames or pictures of silver. The Apostle Paul said, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good for necessary edification, building up, encouraging, Ephesians 4:29. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:3. It's been said that success in marriage is far more dependent upon being the right spouse than finding the right spouse. And you will be the right spouse if you make certain that your spouse feels loved. You make certain that they feel unconditionally loved, that they can never do anything that'll stop your love. I can't tell you how much that'll strengthen a marriage, and that you praise them constantly. Last word from Solomon about this subject. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 9, addressed to husbands. He said, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days. Live joyfully with her. Folks, you will live joyfully with your spouse if you act like the right spouse. If you need to respond to the invitation, would you come up now and have a seat as we stand and sing the song together?